Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We need to talk about redundancy. My name is Kelly, and I'll be your host for today's session. We'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes, so sit tight while we let a few more people join. So before we get into today's content, we'd love to hear from you. You should see a poll on your screen now. We've put together a few quick questions to give us some insights into where your business sits when it comes to managing redundancy decisions and fair work risks. There are no right or wrong answers. This is just to help us tailor the session and make sure we're covering what matters most to you. Take a moment to fill that in, and we'll share the results towards the end of the session. Well, great, thank you. Let's get into it. My name is Kelly Lagutsa, Sales Director here at Citation Group. Welcome to today's webinar. We need to talk about redundancy. Redundancies are rising across Australian businesses right now, and getting the process right matters more than it ever has. Before we start, just a few housekeeping items. One, if you've got questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering these at the end of the session. Don't wait until the end to submit them. Drop them in as they come to you. Two, yes, this session is being recorded, and we will send the link to everyone after the session so you can revisit the content. We have a few people joining us today, which is great to see. Given the strong attendance, I'm guessing many of you are here because you're facing a redundancy decision right now, or you want to get ahead of one before it lands on your desk. I'm really glad you've joined us today, and by the time we finish, you'll have a clear, practical picture of what a genuine redundancy process looks like and where most businesses trip up. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Tavini Jayakody, Workplace Relations Business Partner at Citation Group. Tavini has a real interest in all things legislation and ERIR, and regularly advises clients on workplace matters to help them land on the best solutions for their business. She's also currently studying a Bachelor of Commerce and Laws, so she brings both the practical, on-the-ground experience and a sharp eye for the legal detail we'll be unpacking today. Before we hand over to Tavini, a word about us. For For more than 30 years, Citation Group has helped businesses manage their workforce and meet their compliance obligations through our expert HR, workplace health and safety, ISO certification, workforce management, and workplace law and migration services. We work with thousands of businesses across the country, for small teams through to large enterprises, helping them to stay compliant, manage risk, and build better workplaces. Today's session is brought to you by Citation HR, our workplace relations and HR advisory arm, and the team Tavini works within. Citation HR has an exclusive offer to share with you today, and that is the release of our annual Workforce Pulse report. Earlier this year, we surveyed over 510 Australian business leaders for our 2026 Workforce Pulse report. The findings are striking. When asked, 97% of leaders feel confident managing their workplace responsibilities. 24% say people issues escalate beyond what they expect often or very often. So that 97% confidence doesn't quite match the reality of hundreds of SMEs tackling this issue. And 1 in 4 leaders say unfair dismissal and disputes are one of the biggest concerns. See the gap between how confident leaders feel and what's actually happening on the ground? It's what we call the confidence trap, and it is part of what we're unpacking today. Let's talk about the environment these conversations are happening in. In 2024 to 2025, the Fair Work Commission received 44,075 applications. That's a 24% above the 5-year average. Over 16,500 of those were unfair dismissal claims, and general protections dismissal claims, the ones tied to discrimination, adverse action, that kind of thing, are up 45% since 2024. It's gotten so bad that the Fair Work Commission President, Justice Hatcher, himself described the current caseload as unsustainable. The takeaway is simple. The cost of getting it wrong has never been higher. Join over 1,000 business leaders who have downloaded our 2026 Workforce Pulse report. Earlier this year, we surveyed 510 Australian businesses to reveal where confidence and reality diverge and what's at stake when those gaps go undressed. You'll see a QR code on the screen now, and this will give you access to our game-changing report for free. I'll give you a few seconds to scan that code or visit the link in the chat box. Okay, that's all from me for now. Over to you, Tavini.
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining today's session. As Kelly mentioned, I'm Tavini, and I will be taking us through the next little bit. So here's the roadmap for today. We'll start with why redundancies are rising, and then we'll get into the legal test that actually defines a genuine redundancy. From there, the common traps. We'll examine a high court case that's just raised the bar on redeployment, provide a practical checklist, and how to look after the team that stays. We'll finish with a 5-point recap on what was discussed. Let's start with the landscape because redundancy is no longer something only large corporates need to think about. Across Australia, employers are facing rising labour costs, tighter margins, changing customer demand, rapid technological change, and increasing pressure to do more with fewer resources. For small and medium-sized businesses, these pressures can emerge quickly. The loss of a major client, reduced demand, or significant increase in operating costs can all trigger a genuine need to review whether the existing workforce structure remains sustainable. The key point is this. Redundancy, it's not a sign that a business has failed. It is often a legitimate response to changing operational needs. However, the law does not simply ask whether there was a sound commercial reason for the change. It asks whether the employee's job is genuinely no longer required to be performed by anyone because of operational changes. whether any applicable consultation obligations were met, and whether suitable redeployment opportunities were properly considered. That distinction is where many employers encounter difficulty. Consider a few common examples. A cafe may move from table service to counter service and genuinely require fewer supervisory positions. A professional services firm may lose a major client and no longer need the same number of consultants. A manufacturer may introduce new software or automation that changes the mix of administrative and production roles. Each of these may justify redundancy, provided the business follows the correct process. These situations are becoming increasingly common. Again, cost of living pressures, rising fuel and input costs, increasing wage and superannuation obligations, and the growing use of AI and automation are all reshaping workforce requirements. If your business has not yet had to consider a redundancy, there is a good chance it may need to in the future. As shown on the slide, approximately 268,000 Australians were retrenched just in 2025. Now, that's the highest number since the post pandemic rebound. Looking ahead, 19% of employers anticipated undertaking further redundancies heading into early 2026, highlighting that workforce restructures remain a significant issue for Australian businesses. So, when is a redundancy actually genuine? Under Section 389 of the Fair Work Act, there are three limbs, and all three must be satisfied. The first limb is that the employer no longer requires the employee's job to be performed by anyone because of changes in operational requirements. That means we're looking at the job, not simply the person. If the same work is still required and is simply handed to someone else under a different title, that's a red flag. The second limb is consultation. If an award or enterprise agreement applies and contains a consultation clause, the employer must follow it. That generally means notifying the employee of the proposed change, explaining the likely impact, giving them a genuine opportunity to respond, and considering any alternatives they put forward before a final decision is made. Consultation is not a courtesy meeting after a decision has already been locked in. The third limb is redeployment. Before proceeding with a redundancy, employers must consider whether it would have been reasonable to redeploy the employee within the business or an associated entity. This means looking beyond vacant positions and considering whether there is suitable alternative work available, taking into account the employee's skills, experience, location, remuneration, any training required, and as we'll discuss shortly, whether the work could reasonably be reorganized to facilitate redeployment. To bring this to life, imagine a retail business closes its storeroom and moves to direct supplier deliveries. At first glance, the stockroom assistant role may appear genuinely redundant. However, if the employee's day-to-day duties are simply redistributed amongst two sales assistants and a short time later, the business recruits a stock flow coordinator performing substantially the same work, the question becomes whether the role genuinely ceased to exist or whether it was simply renamed or reallocated. As you listen today, think about the last time your business changed reporting lines, redistributed duties, or reduced hours. Was it clear that a position genuinely disappeared, or did the work simply move to someone else? That distinction is often when the legal risk begins and where the Fair Work Commission will focus its attention if a redundancy is challenged. Now, this all sounds simple, but it's routinely failed in practice. And failing even one of these limbs means the redundancy isn't genuine, which opens the door to an unfair dismissal claim. So, where does it go wrong? The traps SMEs fall into. In practice, we see the same four pitfalls arise time and time again, and they're often what determine whether a redundancy withstands scrutiny if it is later challenged. The first is failing to consult. This often happens because managers are trying to act quickly or are concerned about creating uncertainty within the business. However, where consultation obligations apply, employees must be given a genuine opportunity to provide feedback before a final decision is made. Consultation is intended to be meaningful, it's not just a formality. Simply informing an employee that their role is redundant and their employment is ending is not a genuine consultation. The second is treating redeployment as a simple vacancy check. It's not enough to conclude there are no advertised vacancies and move on. Employers should be able to demonstrate that they considered suitable alternative roles within the business and any associated entities, assess the employee's skills, experience, and suitability, and considered whether reasonable training or adjustments could have facilitated redeployment. The third is changing the title, but not the job. If one role disappears and shortly afterwards, a substantially similar role is created under a different title, the Fair Work Commission will look beyond the label and examine the substance of the work actually being performed. The key question is whether the job genuinely ceased to be required or whether it was simply repackaged and allocated to someone else. The fourth is overlooking final entitlements. Even where the redundancy itself is lawful, errors in calculating notice, redundancy pay, annual leave, long service leave, superannuation, or award entitlements can still expose the business to claims and to payment issues and unnecessary disputes. To illustrate how these issues can overlap, imagine a small administration team of 3 employees. The business introduces new software that significantly reduces manual processing and determines it now only requires 2 positions. That may be a genuine operational change. However, if the employer selects for redundancy the employee who recently raised workplace concerns, skips consultation, cannot explain how the selection decision was made, and gives little consideration to redeployment, the restructure may appear to be performance management or retaliation disguised as a redundancy. As you think about your own workplace, ask yourself this. If someone external reviewed your redundancy file tomorrow, would they see a clearly documented business rationale, evidence of genuine consultation, a considered redeployment assessment, and accurate final pay calculations? If the answer is no, that's the gap to address before implementing the restructure. Any one of these pitfalls can turn an otherwise legitimate redundancy into a costly legal dispute. Getting the process right from the outset is often what makes a difference between a genuine redundancy and an unfair dismissal claim. Before we move on, it's worth highlighting one important legislative change: the introduction of the criminal underpayment regime. Since the 1st of January 2025, intentionally underpaying wages or employee entitlements can constitute a criminal offense. While the regime is not intended to capture genuine payroll mistakes or inadvertent errors, it has significantly increased the consequences where an employer knowingly fails to pay employees their lawful entitlements in full and on time. This is particularly relevant in the context of redundancies, where final pay calculations are often both complex and time sensitive. Employers may need to calculate notice or payment in lieu of notice, redundancy pay under the National Employment Standards, or an applicable industrial instrument, accrued annual leave, long service leave, depending on the relevant jurisdiction, rostered days off, commissions, allowances, and superannuation. When a business is managing a restructure, there can be pressure to process these payments quickly. That is often when errors occur. For example, imagine an employee with 6 years service. They've got accrued annual leave, a contractual notice entitlement, and whose redundancy pay must be assessed under both the applicable award and the National Employment Standards. If payroll processes only the employee's ordinary wages and annual leave, but overlooks the redundancy entitlement, the business may inadvertently create a far more significant compliance issue than the restructure itself. As you think about your own processes, it is helpful to separate the termination process from the termination payment. Both require careful review. An employer may follow a procedurally fair redundancy process and issue a well drafted termination letter. But if the final pay is inaccurate or delayed, a business may still face legal and financial exposure. In the past, a miscalculated final payment may have been viewed primarily as a payroll compliance issue. Today, ensuring redundancy pay, notice, and accrued leave are calculated correctly the first time is an important part of managing legal risk. It's not simply an administrative best practice. The cost of getting it wrong. If a redundancy is found not to be genuine, the consequences can extend well beyond the dismissal itself. The Fair Work Commission may determine that the employee was unfairly dismissed and can order remedies, including reinstatement or compensation. Reinstatement, in particular, can be commercially and operationally challenging where the business has already implemented the restructure, redistributed work, or filled other positions. Beyond any financial liability, there is also the practical cost of defending a claim. Even where the ultimate compensation is modest, responding to proceedings requires significant time, management attention, and legal resources, often at a time when the business is already navigating organizational change. There is also a reputational dimension to consider. Workplace disputes can become known to current employees, prospective candidates, customers, suppliers, and the broader industry. For many small and medium sized businesses, reputation is closely tied to the owners and leadership team. How a business manages a redundancy can shape perceptions of its culture, values, and integrity. Importantly, the employees who remain are also watching. They will naturally ask themselves, did this happen to me? Was my colleague treated fairly? Was the business transparent throughout the process? The way a redundancy is handled can have a lasting impact on employee trust, engagement, and morale, well beyond the individual whose employment has ended. Ultimately, taking the time to plan the process, consult appropriately, consider redeployment, and ensure final entitlements are correct is a relatively small investment compared to the financial, operational, and reputational cost of getting it wrong. What the High Court just changed. Most SME owners haven't heard of Helensburgh Coal v. Bartley, but they should, because it changes what genuine redeployment means in practice. So let's spend some time on this case because it is the case that many employers will need to build into their redundancy thinking from now on. Helensburgh Coal operated the Metropolitan Coal Mine. During the COVID downturn, demand reduced and the business restructured its operations. A number of permanent roles were cut. The employees did not simply argue that the business had no reason to restructure. Instead, their argument focused on redeployment. They said that work was still being performed at the mine by contractors, and that it would have been reasonable to redeploy some of the affected employees into that work rather than dismissing them. The employer's position was that redeployment should be about vacant roles. In other words, if there was no vacancy, there was no redeployment option. The High Court rejected that narrow approach. It confirmed that the Commission can look more broadly at whether the employer could have made changes to how it used its workforce to make redeployment reasonable in all the circumstances. That does not mean every contractor must be removed before an employee can be made redundant. It does not mean the business loses the right to make commercial decisions, but it does mean the employer needs to be able to show that it considered the workforce as a whole: employees, contractors, labor hire, associated entities, future plans, skills, training, cost, risk, and operational feasibility. For SMEs, the practical message is simple. If you use contractors or labor hire while making employees redundant, pause and document the analysis. Ask, what work are those contractors doing? Could the employee perform it now? Could they perform it with reasonable training? Would changing the arrangement be commercially and operationally reasonable? If the answer is no, ensure that you record why. If the answer is maybe, get advice before you move to dismissal. Let's unpack that with a practical example. Imagine a business has a permanent warehouse supervisor whose role is proposed for redundancy because the business is reducing permanent headcount. At the same time, it continues using labor hire workers to cover dispatch, stock control, and weekend rostering. Before moving to termination, the employer should ask whether any of that work could reasonably be performed by the affected employee, either immediately or with reasonable training. The answer may still be no. The work may require different licenses, different availability, a materially lower classification, or at a cost structure that would be unreasonable to unwind. But the important point is that the employer has to do the thinking and keep evidence of that thinking. Ellensburg makes it harder to rely on a narrow statement like, there were no vacancies, therefore, there were no reasonable redeployment options. A useful way to explain this to managers is as follows. Redeployment is not just a job board search. It's an operational review. Consider who is doing the work. Where is it being done? How long will it continue? Did the affected employees do it? What would need to change? Would that change be reasonable for the business? To the audience, I ask, if your business uses contractors, consultants, or labor hire, think about whether you could quickly produce a list of what they do, how long they're engaged for, and whether that work overlaps with employees whose roles may be affected. If the answer is no, perhaps that can be an action item from today. So, what does this mean in practice? First, there are no vacancies is no longer the end of the inquiry. Checking for vacant positions is still the starting point, but it is not the finish line. Employers should also consider how work is being performed across the business and any associated entities, and whether there is a reasonable way to redeploy the employee into existing work, even if that requires some adjustment to duties or a redistribution of responsibilities. Second, documentation is more important than ever. If a redundancy is challenged, it is not enough for a manager to say, we considered redeployment. The Fair Work Commission will expect evidence of that assessment. This may include organizational charts, list of available roles, contractor arrangements, notes of redeployment discussions, consultation records, and documented reasons why particular positions were or were not considered suitable. Third, businesses that engage contractors should expect greater scrutiny. Where work continues to be performed by contractors, labor hire workers, or consultants, the Commission may ask whether that work could reasonably have been performed by the affected employee instead. To illustrate, imagine a business proposes to make an administration employee redundant because there are no vacant positions. During the redeployment assessment, however, it becomes apparent that the business consistently engages contractors to perform administrative support several days each week, and the employee has previously undertaken substantially similar work. While that does not automatically mean redeployment is required, it is a factor the employer should actively consider and document before deciding that redundancy is the only available outcome. As you think about your own restructures, consider asking one additional question during the planning stage. Where else is similar work being performed across the business, even if there isn't a vacant position? That simple question can significantly strengthen your redeployment assessment and help demonstrate that the business genuinely explored reasonable alternatives before proceeding with dismissal. The overall shift is that redeployment is no longer a narrow vacancy exercise. It requires employers to take a broader, evidence based, and forward looking approach before concluding that an employee's employment must come to an end. Your checklist, how to run a process that holds up. So, what does a defensible redundancy process look like in practice? Well, every situation is different. Following these 5 steps will put your business in a much stronger position if the redundancy is ever challenged. Step 1, document the business rationale. Before speaking with the employee, clearly record the operational reason for the proposed change. What has changed? Why is the role no longer required? What alternatives were considered? Who made the recommendation? What information or business data supports the decision? This doesn't need to be a lengthy business case, but it should be clear, evidence based, and prepared before consultation begins. Step 2, check your consultation obligations. Identify whether an applicable award or enterprise agreement requires consultation and follow those obligations carefully. Prepare a consultation letter explaining the proposed changes, the reasons for them, the likely impact on the employee, and inviting their feedback before any final decision is made. Consultation should be genuine. If the employer proposes an alternative structure or raises suggestions to avoid redundancy, consider those proposals on their merits and respond to them thoughtfully. Step 3, conduct a genuine redeployment assessment. Review current vacancies, anticipated vacancies, associated entities, lower level roles, part time opportunities, and, where relevant, work being performed by contractors or labor hire workers. Consider whether reasonable training or minor adjustments would enable the employee to perform another role. Most importantly, document what was considered and why each option was or was not deemed suitable. For example, if the affected employee is a senior bookkeeper, the redeployment assessment shouldn't simply be stopped simply because there isn't another senior bookkeeper vacancy. It may be reasonable to consider payroll support, accounts administration, finance project work, or a part time accounting role, depending on the employee's skills and the operational needs of the business. The alternative role doesn't need to be identical. It simply needs to be a reasonable option in the circumstances. As you undertake that assessment, challenge broad statements like, they're not suitable. Ask why. Is it because of the location? Is it because of hours or qualifications? Maybe it's the remuneration. What about the business needs? A well documented explanation is far easier to defend than a general conclusion. Step 4, manage the consultation and outcome respectfully. Redundancy discussions are often difficult, and employees may feel shocked, disappointed, or anxious. Be careful, be clear about whether the proposal is still under consultation or whether a final decision has been made. Explain the business rationale without becoming defensive, avoid attributing blame, outline the next steps, and give the employee an opportunity to ask questions. The way the conversation is handled often influences how the process is perceived. Step 5, verify final entitlements before confirming termination. Before employment ends, ensure payroll, HR, and the applicable industrial instrument have all been considered. Confirm that notice, redundancy pay, accrued leave, long service leave, where applicable, superannuation, and any other contractual or statutory entitlements have been correctly calculated. If there is any uncertainty, it's far better to pause and verify the calculations than to correct an underpayment after the event. By working through these 5 steps in this order, you'll address the key legal requirements of a genuine redundancy while also putting the business in the strongest practical position should the decision later be scrutinized by the Fair Work Commission. How to How you handle one departure shapes trust and psychological safety for everyone who remains. How do you manage the team that stays? After a redundancy, the remaining team may be carrying extra workload, uncertainty about the business, and concern about whether more changes are coming. If leaders say nothing, people will fill the gap with rumors. As shown here on the slide, 68% of Australian employees are worried about redundancy in their workplace. To handle trust and psychological safety of the remaining team, leaders should be respectful in their communications, but also ensure that you're only providing limited needed to know information. You don't need to disclose personal details. You can say that the business has made a structural change, that the affected employee has been treated in line with the required process, and that the business will support the team through the transition. Be honest about what you know and avoid giving any false reassurance. It's also important to reset workload priorities. If a role is removed, but all of the work remains, the team will quickly conclude that the redundancy was simply a cost cutting exercise that pushed pressure onto everyone else. Leaders should be clear about what work stops, what work changes, and what support is available. Let's bring it together with 5 things to remember. First, the role is gone and the redundancy is lawful are not the same thing. You need to satisfy the legal test, not just identify a business reason. Second, redeployment now considers a broader lens. Ellensberg reminds us that employers may need to look beyond vacant roles and consider how work is actually being performed. Third, final pay is not an administrative afterthought. It's a compliance risk area, especially since intentional underpayment can now have criminal consequences. Fourth, consultation must be genuine where it is required. It needs to happen before the final decision, and the employee's response must be considered. Fifth, the way you handle the process will affect the confidence and trust of the team that stays. If you remember nothing else from today, remember this: redundancy is both a legal process and a human process. You need the paperwork, the consultation, the redeployment assessment, and the final pay to be right. But you also need the conversation to be handled with care. You don't have to navigate this alone. At Citation HR, we support employers before, during, and after redundancy decisions. That can include sense checking whether the business rationale is sound, identifying consultation obligations, preparing consultation letters, guiding redeployment assessments, reviewing contractor or labor hire arrangements, and checking final entitlements before anything is issued. We can also support the practical side, preparing managers for the conversation, helping with scripts, and advising on communications to the remaining team. The best time to get advice is before the decision is implemented, because that is when you still have options. Thanks, everyone. That's all from me for now. I'm going to pass it back to Kelly.
Thanks, Tavini. That was a fantastic presentation with lots of practical takeaways for everyone. Before we finish up and get into your questions, I wanted to quickly look back at the poll we ran at the start of the session. 75% of you have already made or are weighing up redundancies, which means 3 in 4 of you are already living this, and this is exactly why we built today's session. 76% aren't fully confident their last redundancy would survive a challenge. So only 1 in 4 of you could prove it on paper today, and that's the confidence reality gap we opened with. 1 in 3 in the room don't know that underpayment of final entitlements is now a criminal offence. Since January 2025, this isn't just a compliance slap on the wrist anymore. 66% use contractors or labour hire alongside employees. Two-thirds of you are running a contractor-heavy workforce, which is precisely the scenario Helensburgh Coal versus Bartley just put under the microscope. Now let's jump into your questions. We've had quite a few come through, which is great. Let's get through as many as we can. Thanks, Tavini. Can an employee who has been made redundant raise a Fair Work case on their behalf, only that they were treated unfairly, even if this is not the case?
So, even in cases of genuine redundancy, employees will still have access to bring about certain claims. So, for instance, it could be an unfair dismissal claim, it could be a general protection claim. It's just about following a fair process so that you can demonstrate that the business did, in fact, have a genuine reason for the redundancy and it wasn't on a protected reason. That's why your consultation process, your assessment of redeployment, and documentation is super important so that if you are ever in a situation where you're in front of the commission, you can just bring up those reports and kind of defend your position.
That makes sense. How long or what is the timeline the consultation should be done after we have communicated with an employee that the role was no longer required?
Okay, so with timeframes, it really just depends on the business's time frame for removing that role. If you've um, initially anticipate, let's say the role is no longer required within the next 2 weeks because of X, Y, Z reasons, then of course that consultation process will need to be undertaken within that process, within that 2 week time frame. Um, at Citation HR, we recommend a two-step consultation process. So having that first consultation meeting, as you mentioned, Kelly, where you kind of put them on notice, saying that the role might no longer be required. After that meeting, we recommend at least 24 hours to give the employee the opportunity to consider what was said at that meeting before engaging them in a second consultation, where again, you discuss the reasons for redundancy or the proposed redundancy. You consider redeployment, but you also take the time to hear the employee side of things and their perspective on the proposed redundancy before delivering an outcome.
Thank you. We've had a scenario shared with us. We lost the bulk of a client's contract, but continue to provide a smaller amount of work for a different branch within that same client. Due to the significant reduction in workload, 2 employees were made redundant, and the remaining work was reallocated to other staff members. Could this situation still be regarded as a genuine redundancy?
If you went from, let's say, 5 employees performing the exact same role to 3 because of a reduced workload, yes, it still constitutes a genuine redundancy. It's just you need to ensure that you've gone through a objective selection matrix as to why you've chosen to keep the 3 that remained as opposed to the 2 that were made redundant. And of course, same thing, you need to go through consultation, you need to consider redeployment opportunities before coming to the outcome of redundancy.
Okay, thank you. Where a role has been identified as genuinely redundant and the EBA does not provide for forced redundancies, how do we determine whether an employee can access voluntary retrenchment if that is their preference rather than requiring them to pursue redeployment?
That's a good question. And because it's related to an EBA, I would recommend that you get in touch with Citation HR so we can actually review that document before providing advice.
Yeah, EBAs are complex. Makes sense. Is there a template or best practice guide for redeployment assessments available?
Um, it's something that we would definitely have within our suite, and we can talk you through how to do that. But I would say, as a first starting point, it would be asking the questions that we went through today. One, of course, you can start with your vacant roles to see if that's a suitable redeployment, but also just assessing what skills the employee has, what gaps are there within the business in terms of workloads and where things could potentially be reallocated. Again, contractors, are they performing work that the employer could potentially take up? Those are the sort of
Mhm.
questions that you need to consider when it comes to redeployment.
Thank you. Is consultation required for award-free employees?
Technically, no. It's the consultation obligations come from the modern awards or potentially EBAs. However, it is considered best practice regardless, because could you imagine on Monday you're told that, hey, we don't require a position, and then by Monday afternoon you're sent a termination letter after years of tenure? That can be quite confronting. So even if the employee is award free, we still recommend that you go through that consultation process.
Okay. What do you recommend for selection when you're reducing the number of roles but retaining some? So in the example provided, it's 10 roles reducing to 6. So they're wanting to know what is needed to assure a fair selection process because the
Yeah.
role is award free.
Okay. You'll need to look at things like um, tenure will be one of the requirements in that selection matrix, but also performance or conduct. So basically, the employee's prior disciplinary history. You look at also qualifications, skills, experience, and all of that needs to be put into, let's say, maybe an Excel spreadsheet. So you can clearly document that whilst employee A had better teamwork skills than employee B, employer employee B had, um, you know, better customer deliverables and a faster turnaround time than employee A. That sort of justification all needs to be documented when you're reducing headcount.
Okay. Now, if an employee doesn't have the certifications that the contractors do, are we responsible for paying them to get training, or is that a legitimate reason for using contractors and not the redundant staff?
For the employees that are potentially being made redundant, I think one of the important questions is how reasonable is the time frame for them acquiring that certification? That would be a really important question to know the answer of.
Mhm.
Um, the other part, let's say, is the certification specifically required for the business, or is it just kind of a optional thing? Does the employee necessarily need that particular certification to complete that role? Um, how long will it take for that certification to be completed? Are there any other factors? If this is a live scenario, then again, I do recommend getting in touch with the team so we can talk through it in a bit more detail.
Okay, thank you. I've got a scenario where they're looking at reducing full-time roles to part-time roles as part of a restructure. So the role still does need to be performed, but at a reduced workload. So if the team member doesn't consent to becoming part-time, can that trigger redeployment and redundancy where redeployment is declined?
Yeah, so if a position's going from full-time to part-time, then yes, in this scenario, it seems like the informal conversation to kind of sense check with the employee has happened, to see if they were willing to move into a part-time role. But if not, then yes, again, provided the business has the justification as to why you can no longer hit the full-time hours and need to engage the employees on a part-time basis, then yes, it will be undergoing that redundancy consultation process,
Mhm.
um, explaining that for XYZ reasons, the full time role is no longer required. The redeployment option is the same role, but on a part time basis. If the employee rejects that redeployment opportunity, then the business needs to, well, the employee is made redundant, and then the business potentially might have redundancy pay obligations.
Is outsourcing a function to overseas as it's cheaper a redundancy reason?
Yeah, so that's still an operational change. Again, you would need justification as to why the business has decided to outsource. Now, in this case, I know it's about um, the fact that it's cheaper, um, and then you would still go through the consultation process and you would need to consider redeployment.
Okay. How would an organisation typically manage the consultation process? So, if employees are invited to provide feedback or questions by email, is there an expectation that the organisation responds to or addresses that feedback? If it isn't able to, how is the consultation obligation satisfied?
So, ideally, and best practice would be that the consultation happens in a meeting. However, we understand that sometimes employees may prefer for that consultation to happen in writing. Fair
Mhm.
enough. At least you've provided the opportunity to attend a meeting, and then it was the employee's request to facilitate in writing. Um, the employee's feedback genuinely does need to be considered, and it comes down to, I guess, what kind of feedback are we looking at in this scenario? Um, if they're asking questions that the business aren't really in a position to answer, then of course you can push back and just provide a high level overview. You don't need to be providing confidential information to the employee when they're asking questions about a restructure, just enough that they do genuinely understand why their position is no longer required and why they've been chosen to be made redundant.
You mentioned underpayment. What about overpayments?
Okay, so overpayments in what context? But generally, with overpayments, handling that would come down to a deductions agreement. This one's a bit tricky because I feel like employers can get this quite wrong by just assuming that an employee having signed a contract 4 years ago with an repayment of overpayment clause means that at termination, if they've been overpaid something, that the employer can automatically deduct it. That's not the case. Ideally, the employee consents to repayment of that overpayment at the time the repayment or that deduction is taking place. And in that agreement, there are some very specific terms and pieces of information that need to be contained in that. Again, give us a call. We can talk you through. We've got the templates for deductions agreements as well. We can, I guess, provide advice to make sure that that overpayment is actually going to be, sorry, deduction of overpayment is actually going to be defendable. Um,
Mhm.
yeah.
Is there a minimum time period for consultation process under common law contract and under high income threshold?
Good question. Off the top of my head, there is not, I would say no, but again, I would love to double check that.
Okay. Secondly, is there a time limitation post termination to dispute?
So, generally, one of the most common claims that come out from a case of genuine redundancy is a employee saying my redundancy was not genuine and I was therefore unfairly dismissed. So, an unfair dismissal claim. The employee has 21 days post dismissal to file that complaint with the commission. Um, there are extensions granted in very limited circumstances, but generally it's 21 days.
Okay, thank you. Um, all right, so next question is, are any employees over the high income threshold automatically considered award free?
So, if there is coverage under a modern award because of their role, being over the high income threshold does not automatically mean they're excluded. It just means that generally they won't have access to unfair dismissal.
Okay. As part of redeployment options, can the business change hours, location, or pay rate, or team even?
Sorry, Kelly, could you repeat the question?
Sorry. As part of redeployment options, can the business change the hours, the location, the pay rate, and even the team?
As Redeployment considerations, yes, of course. If you've decided that, you can offer maybe a similar role, not in Sydney, but in Melbourne instead, then of course that should be offered to the employee for their consideration.
Thanks, Tavini, for providing your expert insight. That's all the questions we have time for today. Before we wrap up, here is a final reminder to scan that QR code if you haven't already, which gives you access to our game-changing report for free. You can also visit the link in the chat box from the beginning of the session. Thank you so much for joining us, and a big thank you to Davini for such a valuable session. As I mentioned, we'll send the recording link out to everyone, so keep an eye on your inbox. If you have any further questions or you'd like to chat about how we can help, don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great day.